Hello and welcome to The Greatest Good, a UCL Press podcast. Jeremy Bentham, the 18th and 19th century philosopher, was the intellectual inspiration for the founding of University College London, the first institution in England to admit students without imposing a religious test. Bentham's widely credited with the maxim that actions should be judged by the amount of happiness that each produces. He put it simply in his advice: create all the happiness you are able to create, remove all the misery you are able to remove. I'm your host, Professor Philip Schofield, and Director of the Bentham Project here at UCL. Join me as I explore the ways in which Bentham's thought is still relevant to the ethical problems of the 21st century. Today's a very special episode where Professor Gregory Dart and I hash out the similarities and differences between Romantic and utilitarian thought.
Okay, well, my name is Greg Dart from the English department, and this is Philip Schofield from
the Bentham Project in the Faculty of Laws.
Fantastic. Today we're going to talk a bit about Bentham and the Romantics and issues around that and in relation to the formation of UCL. What interests me about this subject at both ends historically is the way in which the Benthamites and the Romantics are on the same side politically in the 1780s and 1790s with the outbreak of the French Revolution. They're all part of the left, broadly speaking. And indeed, in the 1820s, mid-1820s, when founding UCL, I think they're all in favour of the setting up of this new godless institution. But apart from that, they seem to have very little in common, or at least they get pulled apart by history. And it's always interested me what that's about, what those issues are, what divides them. Not least because there's a possibility there's still a division within the left, if you like, or within progressivism, along similar lines, perhaps around technology. I suppose what happens in the course of the 1790s with writers like Hazlitt and Coleridge and Wordsworth is that they begin to experience a sort of seam or a tear in the left. It's around pauper management, but it's also around the kind of the philosophic calculus, the idea that trying to work out what's best to do can be worked out through this calculation of consequences. And they, in different ways, are still bound up with what you might call a morality of intentions, of the conscience, that there are some things that are just absolutely wrong. Murder is absolutely wrong.
Whereas utilitarianism says there's no such thing.
Yes.
You know, everything's up for assessment. And the utilitarians were always very adverse to intuitionism.
Yes.
That was their philosophically their target. This idea that we have a sense that we know what's right and wrong, an inherent sense.
I mean, Hazlitt's essay on reason and imagination is one of the ones where he actually sort of... the problems for him with utilitarian ethics, as he puts it, is that it's got no good argument against slavery, for example. I mean, Bentham was against slavery. You know, most utilitarians were. So it's not a practical argument about their politics. It's an argument about their philosophy. That, you know, from a greatest happiness of the greatest number principle, you could say, well, slavery is fine, isn't it? Because more people benefit from it than don't benefit from it. And, you know, so Hazlitt gets fantastically impassioned in this essay, trying to argue for what he calls, in a way, a politics of the imagination as against the reason, because of that. And, of course, the passion is important because it's part of what he's arguing for, that our moral response to things, our conscience, our imagining of what it's like to be somebody else is really important to the social idea. What's he say here? He says, thus, for example, an infinite number of lumps of sugar put into Mr. Bentham's artificial ethical scales would never weigh against the pounds of human flesh or drops of human blood that are sacrificed to produce them. In other words, you can't... there's no amount of measurement that will destroy the fact that slavery is just simply wrong. You know, and it's partly an intellectual debate about, you know, moral faculties, as it were, but it's also partly the experience of history, in a way, that if if the French Revolution, which was such a catastrophe, in a way, promised so much, but was such a catastrophe, where does it leave people in terms of their, free will, political action, trying to pick up the debris of the past? For me, at least, one of the big breaks, one of the moments where it seems like a lot of romantics feel, oh gosh, we've got a problem here, is when Malthus publishes his essay on population. Because he, in effect, says there are mathematical reasons why you'll never get rid of poverty. The poverty, vice and misery, he says, is kind of necessary to keep population down. And this is quite devastating to a lot of romantics because they see that as a betrayal. Because suddenly a discourse which had appeared to be quite progressive and to be looking for towards the improvement of people, especially the poor, has now put a lid on that and said, no, you'll never have a free and equal society because it will overpopulate itself. Vice and misery, disease and death are absolutely necessary to the system. My maths tell me this. And so a lot of the energy in Godwin, but also Hazlitt, goes into these replies to Malthus that are, sort of desperate attempts in some way, quite eloquent, but also desperate attempts in some ways to argue against that principle. And what they can see is that social science, with its very firm intellectual grounding, is kind of moving away from them and taking the left, if you like, in a direction that they can't follow. So they're left, they feel, in a kind of political no man's land in the middle. They're not conservatives, but at the same time they feel like the left has given up on its project of liberty, equality and fraternity, they feel, and it's now just become about lecturing to the poor and what Hazlitt calls petty piecemeal improvement. So one of the objections they have to Bentham is not that he's not a reformer, but that his project of reform has, and those of his followers, is whittled down to smaller scale projects that can still be pursued by a Tory government and will sort of twiddle with the system rather than improving it wholesale. And that may not be fair, but that's how they feel. So things like workhouse projects or new prisons and so on, they would just feel that this is state management rather than radical reform.
That's really interesting, and quite right, the New Poor Law of 1834 was a Benthamite response to a particular social problem. From the utilitarian perspective, it's better to do a little than nothing at all. And, let's do what we can, when we can, while we can. But I mean, Bentham was probably the most radical of the utilitarians, and maybe not all his circle would go as far as him in a lot of his prescriptions.
Well, you can see immediately why he might be really useful for government, might be really useful for certain kinds of political decision where you're weighing up the least bad thing to do. But it's not easy from utilitarianism to get to a kind of positive ethos of how to live. All you can get is a series of indications of what not to do.
No, I think that's true. Well, I think Bentham's are very much, you leave it to people themselves to make up their own minds. So there is no catalogue or of good things which we ought to pursue.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that Lamb writes about in his city essays, but also Wordsworth in his rural lyrical ballads, is around beggars. That the notion that beggars should be swept off the streets and put into workhouses to be reprogrammed or to be improved, as it were, is one of the things they want to resist. But again, it's a bizarre, paradoxical, but also strangely powerful argument. They say, no, beggars are good for us because they remind us of our common humanity. And, that we shouldn't wipe beggars off the streets because in some ways they're doing us some good and they allow us to perform our own charity. You're a better person after having given to a beggar and you've reconnected with your common neighbour. The other thing that Lamb says, going quite counterintuitively, especially in the city, it doesn't matter if they're pretending. You pay your money to see these things on the stage. Why are you not prepared to pay your money to this guy, regardless of whether he's got the 7, as it were, hungry children he pretends to have?
I mean, that's great because Bentham, who said that beggars should be placed in workhouses, thinks that begging should be stopped, and on the grounds that the best actors get the most money. We'll be right back after the break. Yeah, I mean, can I just go back to the 1780s and 1790s in that there were no Benthamites then. Bentham was an obscure individual who was involved with the Earl of Shelburne, who was Prime Minister 1782 to 3, but was at the centre of a sort of a coterie of thinkers. Shelburne sought out Bentham and took him under his wing. And Bentham, at the early part of the French Revolution, wrote a series of tracts which were aimed to help the French move from their despotic monarchy to some sort of constitutional monarchy or a parliamentary system. And then from the British perspective, it all went wrong with the tour.
Mm-hmm. When you say help the French, did they ask for his help, or did he give it anyway?
He gave it anyway. But he was close to Brissot, and
who's a kind of moderate Republican of the time.
Yeah, he'd known Brissot when Brissot was in London as a journalist in the early 1780s, and in fact they've formed a sort of discussion group, which Bentham says the only people who ever attended it were himself, Brissot, and Brissot's wife, just the three of them. But and he also had an entree to Mirabeau as well, and the person who became Bentham's translator and redactor was a Genevan called Etienne Dumont, and he was part of the Mirabeau circle. So Bentham had a way into some of the leading figures in the French Revolution, and in 1792 he was made a French citizen by the National Assembly as an appreciation for his efforts. But with the September massacres in 1792 in Paris, when one of his contacts, who was a liberal aristocrat, was stoned to death, Bentham, like the rest, many other people in Britain, became very worried by the French Revolution. And if anything, the French Revolution turned Bentham into a conservative, saying, we don't want reform at the moment, it's too dangerous.
Right. But at what point does he say that the rights of man are nonsense upon stilts?
That's in an essay called Nonsense Upon Stilts, which he wrote in 1795. It only came out after his death, but had he published it, it would have been a really major contribution to the debate on natural rights. And it is regarded as one of the most significant attacks on the notion of natural or even human rights.
Right. Because he's very liberal, progressive, interested in a more democratic society in many ways, but he doesn't believe in a kind of metaphysic of rights. That's right.
So, legal rights founded on the principle of utility were, he supported, but the idea of natural rights, his objection was, well, where do they come from?
So about the right to subsistence, the right to food or something, he would say you've got the right to food if you can find it, but there's not.
No, what he did is he said, let's take the principle of utility. If we're promoting utility, there are four main sub-ends to promote, and one is subsistence. Yeah. So everyone should be given the legal right to subsistence.
Right. But this is a legal right, not a natural right.
Yeah. But that's what legislators ought to do. So you can't just assume that a right exists because you want it to.
Yes.
As he says, hunger is not bread. Yeah. Want is not supply. And he came, with the famous phrase, natural rights is nonsense, natural and imprescriptible rights is nonsense upon stilts. So there's another story has to be told. How is it that Bentham became a very radical Republican?
Right.
And is what's sometimes called his conversion to political radicalism is dated to 1809, when he started writing on parliamentary reform. But he'd been moving towards that position for several years. And
is he quite vocal about that? Because that's still quite a dangerous thing to say, isn't it? In the sort of post-war Napoleonic period Britain, almost nobody's an avowed Republican because you're just identified with Robespierre.
It was 1817 before he published his Plan of Parliamentary Reform. Part of it written in 1809 to 10, a bulk of it in 1816 to 17, and that was the first utilitarian defence of democracy. So in a sense, that's when he came out of that particular political closet. Right. To the acclaim of radicals. And by 1818, not only was he supporting parliamentary reform, which he called democratic ascendancy, but by 1818 he moved to republicanism. Right. And so it's that later Bentham of the 1810s, 1820s that we think about as the radical political Bentham.
Right. So he gets more radical as he gets older.
Yeah.
He's quite old at the 1820s.
Yeah, he was born 1748, so by 1809 he was just over 60.
Would I be right to kind of characterise him as, he's a man of independent means, he writes what he wants, he doesn't have to publish it, he can move from one idea to the other, and he's not political in a way, he's not trying to develop a party or a group of followers. People are attracted to him intellectually and he come to the house and talk to him and so on. But he's not trying to engage with politics, he's not actively trying to influence opinion himself.
I think that's true until this later stage.
Right.
In a sense, in the period of the Enlightenment, let's say up to 1790, the reforming states seemed to be those which were governed by absolute monarchs like Catherine the Great, and maybe Frederick the Great in Prussia.
So enlightened despots.
Yeah. So one of his plans was that he would present a penal code to Catherine the Great, which made more sense in that his brother was in the Russian service and had been introduced to Catherine the Great and was something of a favourite of hers, and worked for Prince Potemkin, who was her favourite, who was Catherine the Great's lover. So Jeremy went out to Russia with a view to present his penal code to Catherine the Great. He never did. He chickened out. But the point for him was that any regime could introduce a utilitarian code of laws. And even in the 1810s, he approached the President of the United States at the same time as he approached the Emperor of Russia, with a view to them introducing or commissioning him to produce codes of penal law and civil law. By 1818, he'd come to the conclusion that it was only a democratic regime which would be motivated to introduce penal and civil codes. So that's when we get the really radical Bentham. He sees the community divided between oppressors and oppressed. So a binary distinction. And, the oppressors are the church, the lawyers, the aristocrat, the whole monarchical, aristocratical despotism. And he sees the mixed constitution, so lauded by British commentators, as unstable. Either it's going to become a despotism, an absolute despotism, or it's going to move to representative democracy. And so in the 1820s, for instance, he got very involved in politics and trying to influence political opinion. I mean, he corresponded with Robert Peel, Duke of Wellington, but perhaps more striking is his alliance with Daniel O'Connell, the Irish liberator, with a view to introducing law reform. So he was hoping that O'Connell would bring petitions from the Irish Catholics that would be combined with petitions from the radicals in London and elsewhere in Britain, and put pressure on Parliament to introduce law reform. So it was an important step in his view to the utilitarian codification of the law, which had been sort of his lifelong ambition, because he saw law as crucial. Get the law right, then you can give people the framework in which they can pursue their own pleasures. We'll be right back after the break.
The Greatest Good's first documentary is out on YouTube now. Learn more about Bentham and discover the hidden history of the Veer Street coterie from leading academics at UCL. Click the link in our podcast description or search YouTube for The Greatest Good, Bentham's Defence of Sexual Liberty.
And I mean, one of Bentham's formative experience, most important formative experience, was being forced to swear to the 39 Articles of the Church of England in order to take his degree at Oxford. And in 1818, he published Church of Englandism and its Catechism Examined, which he said, this is an expiation, a putting right of the fact that I compromise myself by swearing to the 39 Articles. And his main argument there was that education should not be linked to a religious test. Teach religion by all means, but teach the religion of Jesus, not the religion of the Church of England, which he saw as different.
Wow, so it's a bit John Lennon then in that sense.
Yeah. and in the mid-1810s, Bentham had written a tract called Chrestomathea, which he took from the Greek to mean useful learning, in opposition to his own education at Oxford, which had been theology and dead languages. And so the idea was you taught useful subjects on the grounds that what's education for? Well, two things. One is for the happiness of the individual who is being educated, and the other is for the happiness of the society to which that individual will contribute. And that seems to be the inspiration for the establishment of the University of London, which became University College London soon afterwards. The official foundation was in 1826. Professors were appointed, I think, in 1827. Teaching started in 1828. It seems that the two main movers and shakers, if you like, were James Mill for the utilitarian and radicals, and Henry Broome on the part of the Whigs.
Whig lawyer.
Yeah. And very soon afterwards, the Church of England responded with the establishment of King's College.
And I think there's an acknowledgement, isn't there, in the Anglican establishment generally, that it's an amazing thing, University College, but it's also got nothing to beat, because you just don't get a good education at Oxford and Cambridge at the time. You get classics and a bit of maths. And so that the idea, a lot of the younger Romantics go to Hackney College in the 1790s, which is already as a kind of proto-university college in some ways, because you get...
These are dissenting academies, which had quite a high reputation.
Where you get taught useful things.
Or Hailbury, where the East India Company taught people who were going out to serve in India.
Right.
So I know there was some sort of serious economics taught there, but what else? I don't know.
In 1825, there's an article here I've got on the London University and the Smutty Gazette, and it's all about really trying to repudiate the establishment charge against this new university, which had all kinds of mud slung at it from the Anglican establishment that didn't think such a place should exist, not least because it should have a religious foundation to it. And it's a rather wonderful defence of the Cockney College, as it's been called, and the kind of things that it's going to teach, and the kind of people it's going to teach. Because part of the argument against UCL is that it's going to take its student population from what it calls the underbred Cockneys, the lower middle class, as it were, and that this is clearly a bad thing, as it were, because it's going to dilute the ruling class or the professional classes in the wrong way. And there's also a wonderful argument against, or I should say rather, defence of the non-religious foundation of the college, because it says just because people aren't going to get religious instruction at the college doesn't mean that they won't be able to get it from elsewhere. It's not, in other words, this is not an atheist institution. It's just an institution that's not going to be teaching a particular line of or particular kind of Christianity, i.e. Anglicanism. So, don't think of it as being anti-religious or atheistical. Just think of it as being secular. And in fact, a lot of the people who were involved early on, weren't they, with the setting up of UCL, were not atheists. They were dissenters, very religious in many ways, who had, a say behind the setting up of the University Church, which is right by our buildings. People like William Crabb Robinson, actually, is a good connective figure, because he knew all the Romantics. He was a kind of diarist of the Romantics. He's one of the only people who's read Kant apart from Coleridge. But he also hangs around an enormously long time and is really useful he's a kind of facilitator for University College for many time. And he's definitely believes in God, but he's also he's one of the good guys. He believes in progress. He believes in this sort of broad church, really, of a kind of reforming institution.
In fact, a lot of the utilitarians were various shades of nonconformists. And, of course, there seems to have been a lot of Jewish money put into the college. I think Isaac Goldsmith, a Jewish financier. We sort of don't know enough about where the money came from. But again, that was showed a commitment to college not being anti-religious, to the university not being anti-religious as such, but rather embracing freedom of religion.
And my sense of it is that when people move together to set up UCL, it's a mixture of romantics and utilitarians. People like Thomas Campbell, Scottish poet and sort of educationalist, lecturer around London, and John Flaxman, the sculptor, is obviously, he's a friend of Blake. So there are people around who are very definitely on the art scene, really, who are cultural movers and shakers, and not that they're not anti-utilitarian, but that they're not associated necessarily with that, with the new social science, as it were, as well as there being lawyers and kind of Benthamite followers and so on. So interestingly, it seems as if actually when a project arrived that would allow for all of these variously non-established or anti-establishment or non-establishment people to come together around this new university, they were quite happy to collaborate.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please make sure to leave a review and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts, and tune in for next week's episode.